right, Keith, good to have you on Out of Consensus. Thank you so much for joining.
Glad to be here.
So, Keith, you have been very much involved in advising companies, think tanks. You are a practitioner. I called you, for better or for worse, a Renaissance man that is looking at many, many issues. You have been an advisor on various topics. And you brought to my attention something that we both probably see as something underappreciated, that especially investors probably don't really look into right now because geopolitics is messy. And these are the Abrahamic Accords. So maybe let's start by giving us a little bit of background, like how this all came about and where we now, because the whole thing started in 2020, if I remember it correctly, right?
A lot of it is to do with Jared Kushner, the son-in-law of Donald Trump. And he happened to have a close family relationship with the leader of the Israeli state, Mr. Netanyahu. It was a rather interesting original idea, which differed from the traditional approach that the US had used. Kushner was saying, well, let's listen to our friends in the Middle East and identify what their major concerns are.
Right.
And it turned out that their major concern was not the future of the Palestinian state. They were much more concerned about security issues, and they were very concerned about the threat posed by Iran. And so you then saw the emergence of this new initiative, the Abraham Accords, which was actually announced at the White House. So the United States, and Kushner in particular, were very, very involved. They served a pivotal role in establishing the Abraham Accords. And the Abraham Accords is an agreement between Israel. It's all about normalizing diplomatic and commercial relationships between Israel, Morocco, Bahrain, the Emirates, and the Sudan. Rather curiously, Kosovo joined later on.
Interesting.
And Jordan and Egypt already have pretty, normal relations with Israel. So those are the countries we're talking about. And the exciting opportunity, in my view, which is one that's been overlooked, is the possibility of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia joining the Abraham Accords. And I'd like to point out to your viewers a very interesting quote I came across from the effective ruler of Saudi Arabia, known as MBS, where he said last year, "We don't look at Israel as an enemy. We look at them as a potential ally with many interests that we can pursue together. But we have to solve some issues before we get to that." So what's really interesting is the possibility of Saudi Arabia joining these accords, which have already proved to be pretty successful.
Could you elaborate a little bit on the significance of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia joining the Abrahamic Accords?
Well, for a start, it's got a much bigger population. I was just looking this morning at population figures for countries in the Middle East. And if you look at Bahrain, you're only talking about 1.87 million people. United Arab Emirates has 9.5 million people, but only 11.5% of them are Emirati citizens. Everyone else is a sort of guest worker. If you look at Saudi Arabia, they have 36 million, which is almost as many as Morocco. Morocco's population is 37 million. Israel has a population just shy of 10 million. So that, I think, is the significance. It's a much bigger economy. And of course, with the hydrocarbon interests, and the activities of the Saudi Arabian investment fund, Sovereign Wealth Fund, PIF, you're seeing an immense amount of investment going on, not just in Saudi Arabia, but in the Middle East region and also worldwide. So it's a game changer if Saudi Arabia joins.
And what kind of, obviously not to be fully exact, but like what kind of probability would you assign the Saudis joining?
In terms of whether it would be done in the next 2 years, I'd say under 50%. But if we're looking at what might happen in 2 years' time, beyond that, I think it would certainly, be a probability. I think what needs to be done is that countries and citizens need to see the benefits that are being reaped already from the Abraham Accords. And a good example of that is the successful trading relationship between the United Arab Emirates and Israel, which is quite striking. Another thing which the Saudi Arabians are very keen to promote at the moment, opportunities for tourism. And you've seen a huge explosion from zero to quite significant figures of Israeli tourists going to particularly United Arab Emirates, Dubai, and Morocco. So, for example, in 2022, no less than 470,700 Israelis took tourist flights to Arab Abraham Accord countries. As I say, Morocco and Emirates were the principal destinations. And you now have 17 new scheduled airline services that were established last year, whereas before there were none. It was impossible to travel directly between Israel and these countries. So it's a very significant aspect.
So then let's look at the players that are involved, because it seems that obviously they might have different incentives, also changing the possibility of the Saudis joining.
Yeah. Well, as I say, it's been a turning point already, but do you want me to talk a little about what's happened in terms of the trade impact, the trade dimension? So just some figures again. In 2022, total trade between the Accord countries amounted to $3.37 billion. You've got to bear in mind that 3 years ago, it was zero. So we've gone from zero to 3.37 billion. Last year, that was an 82% increase in trade on the year before. And so in 2019, you saw trade at 593 million. And one of the interesting points, which was pointed out by John Rakolta, former US ambassador to the United Arab Emirates, he points out that the total population of the Accord countries is now nearly 500 million. This creates, in his view, a sizable market poised for explosive growth. So I think this is an underappreciated aspect of the Abraham Accords, because I think a lot of people just look on it as a sort of diplomatic a deal, or something to do with the fact that you can now take flights between these countries, but it's already beginning to have real commercial benefits for the members concerned.
And do you see this across the different players involved, or is there any difference?
Yeah, I tell you one thing that's interesting. If you look at Europe, in terms of trade, nearly 2/3 of all trade is trade between EU countries. If you look at the Middle East, it's only 13%. So they're not trading that much between themselves. So the Abraham Accords is acting as a catalyst, in my view.
Right.
And I think that's quite a significant factor. And you see it particularly in sectors of the economy like jewelry and pearls. I'd just like to sort of refer to this as a case study. I wrote something only 6 weeks ago about UK trade with the United Arab Emirates. And much to my astonishment, when I looked at the official figures, I discovered that the United Kingdom last year, their major export to the United Arab Emirates was jewelry and pearls. And we sold, remember, there are only about 10 million people living in the Emirates, and only 10% of them are Emirati. So they're buying an awful lot of jewelry. But we sold $5.5 billion worth of jewelry to the United Arab Emirates last year. And it's very interesting. Now they've opened up the jewelry trade, particularly the diamond trade, between Israel and the United Arab Emirates. Some figures from the Dubai Multi-Commodities Center show that in 2022, the diamond trade reached $1.75 billion. Again, there was none 3 years ago. You're now looking last year at $1.75 billion worth. So it's quite sizable. And this lucrative trade is staggering. It soared by 72% in the rough diamond trade and 50% in the polished trade. And also very significantly, in May of last year, the United Arab Emirates signed the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement with Israel. And this eliminates tariffs on diamonds and precious stones. So I would suggest that this diamond trade, jewelry trade, is an example of the potential for trade between Israel and its Arab partners. And it's something that's very much overlooked.
And do you see, obviously, so more economic integration, like what's the outlook? Do you see this just continuing because the catalyst, is there now? Or, where is it heading, let's say over the next 12 months, 24 months? Any particular risk that could derail that? Is it just like a continuation that we're going to see in many different industries? Is it just jewelry, or is it like, something else as well? Is it, where's this heading?
Okay, so here is my view about how things could go wrong. First of all, we now have a relatively right-wing Orthodox government in Israel under Mr. Netanyahu. It's a coalition government. And some of the members of that government, are rather strident and robust, if one used a diplomatic phrase, about their attitudes towards the Palestine and the West Bank and so on. Mm-hmm. And it's very interesting, significant that you've seen some violent outbreaks on the West Bank and in the Gaza. But significantly, other members of the Accords, notably United Arab Emirates, have intervened behind the scenes because they're so committed. They see the potential of the Abraham Accords. They've intervened so that despite there being issues both last year and this spring, it's not got out of hand. And there's a commitment to the Accords. You've also seen very interesting sort of mitigation in the traditional enmity between Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. And China is playing a very significant role here. And it's being exemplified by the way in which you're now seeing peace negotiations in the Yemen. I've been doing quite a lot of work on this, and I went over to Geneva last year to talk about the Yemeni situation. But it's been an ongoing, very costly war, which both the Emirates and Saudi Arabia have been involved in. And you're actually seeing China as a new player in the region in many ways. They have strong commercial ties with Iran in terms of oil. They import a lot of oil from Iran. But I think it's a very significant factor that as the United States have withdrawn in terms of their strategic and defense interest in the Middle East, I think this is one of the most important things you really to highlight. they're much more preoccupied about what's happening in Russia, Ukraine, and also what's happening in the Pacific vis-a-vis China and China's influence across the Pacific.
But they filled the vacuum in the Middle East.
And they're filling the vacuum. And nature abhors a vacuum. And China is getting very, very involved. For example, there are all sorts of deals going on now between the Emiratis and Saudi Arabia with their sovereign wealth funds investing in China and vice versa. So you're seeing a kind of a new dynamic there. And particularly with the Biden administration, taking a step back from the Middle East, you're seeing, these new opportunities coming to play. Do you agree with me? It's very significant that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like what I thought was interesting was recent announcements also by, I think, like Blinken, the Biden administration, that they kind of still support very much the Abraham Accords, and
reluctantly to begin with. They were, and because it was so identified with Trump and his son-in-law, they were rather cool on it. But they've seen the benefits, and the fact that there are not so many violent outbreaks as there were. And another very interesting thing with the Biden administration, they were involved in a deal that was sealed last fall, between Lebanon and Israel. So they've recognized each other's maritime borders. And this is significant commercially because it allows both Israel and the Lebanon to start mining or exploring for the gas fields in the Mediterranean. And that's another indication, in my view, of how, I'm not saying it's perfect, but the Middle East is becoming a slightly safer place than it used to be. Another example of that, which I'd like to highlight for your viewers, listeners, is the way in which Accord members like the Emiratis are now sending ambassadors over to Tehran. There were no diplomatic links at an ambassadorial level for the last 6 years. And just in the last couple of months, you've seen them reopening, embassies and specifically sending ambassadors over. So that's another encouraging sign, I would suggest.
So, in other words, you probably want to get involved right now in the Middle East as a whole, broadly speaking. And you already mentioned a couple of case studies. Is there anything, any event that that you are watching, any kind of leading indicators, so to say, that would kind of take us towards either the Saudi direction, or like, okay, this might be not happening as we kind of are expecting and outlining right now? Is there anything like that you have on your radar?
What I would suggest is that we should have a look at specific industry sectors.
Sure.
And there's a lot of activity going on with renewable energy, green hydrogen, something else I've been writing about. And you're seeing a lot of investment in green hydrogen. And the Israelis have got a lot of technical know-how and expertise, which they could really, offer, particularly to Saudi Arabia. And if you look at a map of where they're developing these green hydrogen facilities, Saudi Arabia is one of the main places. Another very significant thing is electric vehicles. And the way in which, for example, in Saudi Arabia, you've got a US-based concern that are now setting up a manufacturing capability for electrical vehicles, and they're even building a steelworks, to start producing cars. Again, it strikes me that what Israel can do is it can provide its technical know-how and expertise to create jobs in things like renewable energy, pharmaceuticals, electrical vehicles. And this is a tremendous appeal to the Arab countries in the Accords. And it's a particular appeal to Saudi Arabia because they've got a very young demographic.
Right.
Very striking to see. If you look at the Emiratis, I think when I was last looking at it, there are only 4.5% of the Emirati population is over 65. And if you look at the average age, of people in Saudi Arabia and Emirati, the onus is on the rulers of Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, to create jobs for their young population. And this also is significant because the Saudi Arabian leadership realized that they've got to provide jobs for their population, because otherwise they risk civil unrest and extremism. So they've got to give people jobs. So Israel could play a very, very crucial role in providing some of the technical know-how and expertise and finance in certain situations.
So that's interesting. So in other words, we are actually saying here that we are seeing political, economic pragmatism prevail.
And that is reflected in the way in which, when there are violent outbreaks in the Gaza or the West Bank, the Arab members of the Accords are intervening behind the scenes to cool things down. I'm not saying that there are no risks, but I don't think at the moment, it will take a lot of, there would have to be some really major incidents, I think, for this Accord development to start being
unravel. Yeah.
Can I just mention one other thing, which is very important, about sort of soft power in a way? There are tremendous opportunities for tourism, because people, both tourism and things like cultural exchanges, but specifically academic exchanges, for example, with doctors and medics. You've seen in the last 2 years with the Abraham Accords an awful lot of exchanges going on between medical schools in Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, and Israel, and vice versa. And the more people get to know each other, that will play, I think, quite a significant role in bolstering commercial ties. And there are political moves involving the US and the EU, and also British politicians like Liam Fox, somebody I know quite well, where they're seeking to sort of mobilize support and political support within the EU and the UK for the Abraham Accords. And I think more needs to be done on that, really, to sort of develop the Abraham Accords and for it to fulfill its potential.
Yeah. And it's interesting that the people-to-people connection is probably already reflected in the flight connections that you mentioned, right? To a certain extent, which is very interesting.
And there are certain practical things that need to be done at the moment. Israelis have got to apply in a rather cumbersome process for visas to go to Bahrain, and all that sort of thing is relatively straightforward in terms of how you can actually try and speed up things. And there are also calls for increasing airport capacity in Israel so that people can go and visit the country and so on. And of course, Jerusalem has tremendous significance to Muslims, and that, I mean, it's not going to be easy, but there may be ways in which, the Israeli government can make it easier and promote opportunities for travel to Jerusalem and holy sites and so on.
Yes. So Keith, before we wrap this up, like, if I'm an investor, I'm a decision maker at a corporate looking at the region, what do you think is the takeaway from our discussion? So we talked about a range of things, and like, what do you think should people keep in mind?
I tell you one thing that would again be a game changer: if the Accords could introduce something like a Schengen agreement, where if you issue a visa within the EU, people can then travel around, the area. If we could do something like that, which I think is a possibility, in the next 18 months, that again is going to bolster tourism, obviously, cultural exchanges, but also commercial ties. I think the Emirates are leading the way here in things like the jewelry trade, which has really sort of taken off. But if they do more on these practical issues, for example, the Schengen-style passport, that's the sort of thing that's really going to sort of accelerate these commercial developments, which I think have been overlooked.
Yes, for sure. I underrated for sure. Okay, Keith, apart from Cassandra, where can people follow your work?
Well, I'm a research fellow now of 9 think tanks.
Oh, wow.
Policy studies. I'm the regulation fellow of the Institute of Economic Affairs, a senior fellow of the Adam Smith Institute. But I'm also a senior fellow of the Euro Gulf Information Center, which is headquartered in Rome. And they have a very useful website where you'll see that I've been writing quite a lot on issues to do with trade and the Abraham Accords and security aspects. So that is something which is free to access, those particular articles. So that wouldn't be a bad place to start, I suggest. Keith. You might also see me, for your clients who speak Arabic, they'll be able to look me up on Al Jazeera and on YouTube. Where
right, I saw this, yeah.
So I've been appearing on Al Jazeera for something like, crikey, 26, 27 years now.
Wow.
So it's something I enjoy.
Okay, Keith, thank you so much for your time. We both are bullish on the Abraham Accords. I think it's underrated, and I hope we shed some light today that people should look into it for sure.
Yeah, can I just say one final thought that has occurred to me, maybe controversial, with the US presidential elections coming up? If we see the return of Mr. Trump, then his son-in-law, Mr. Kushner, may well be again in a very influential role to push the Abraham Accords. It was in many ways his brainchild. And so if the return of Trump might see, a renewed US interest in the Abraham Accords.
Yes. This would be for sure a huge deal, I think. Okay. Keith, thank you so much for your time. Cheers.
Thank you very much.